People in deconstruction are capable of making mistakes that are just as bad as what evangelicals are committing. They're just usually at the opposite end of the spectrum. Let me illustrate. Whereas evangelicals are typically convinced that meaning is contained in words, so they invest in dictionaries and they go from there and they think that's how you interpret. Big mistake. I'm going to explain why in a minute. Deconstruction people, on the other hand, go in the opposite direction, and it's also a big mistake. They understand quite correctly that words do not have inherent meanings, but then they conclude from that, and this is the big mistake, that therefore texts do not have inherent meanings. I'm going to explain that too in a second. So evangelicals lose everything by putting all their eggs in the basket of words, and people in deconstruction do the opposite and they also lose everything. And the reason they both lose everything in opposite ways is because they don't understand hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the art of good interpretation, and sadly hardly anyone pays attention to it. I've taught in seminaries and universities around the world, and I know what I'm talking about. Hardly anyone focuses on it. Some people use the word, and that's about as far as it goes. By the way, I know what you're thinking because you tell me in the comments every day. You're thinking something like this: if this is how it is, then what hope do we have of ever getting it right? Let me tell you a little story. When I was in Cambridge, England for my PhD, I spent most of my time in a research institute. At any one time, there were about 40 of us. And practically every time we took a tea break, because this is England, it became clear there were about 35 different theological positions represented by us. So what hope do you have of getting it right ever? Well, here's how. If I look at those 40 at any one time and ask myself what are they doing today and how they are contributing to theological knowledge, the answer is that a very small number of them happen to agree on a lot, and they happen to be the ones who've attended to hermeneutics. The vast majority of them have not. So therefore, if I wanted to learn theologically, I would go to one of them. This is no different than in medical research. You could look at medical research and you'd have to conclude that everybody pulls on a different thread, and that is true. And yet we've made massive advances in medical research, so somebody got it right, right? You're not going to have a medical event and not go to the hospital because you think, what chance do we have? You go there because some have shown that they got it right. There is hope, is what I'm telling you. The majority have become what we call in German Fachidioten. That means subject idiots. You know what I mean? People who are so specialized they can't see anything else. And if you had to choose between Fachidioten, of course you would despair, but thankfully you don't have to. You've got to invest in good interpretation, and whether the thing is called hermeneutics, a funny word, or not doesn't really matter. It's the substance that matters. It's the approach and the skills we have to acquire to do well. At the end of this video, I'm going to point out a course to you, a live course that attends exactly to this. It's cohort-based. We're going to meet online live, and it starts in about 2 weeks. So if you want to become a better interpreter, have a look at the end of this video. You know what makes me a little bit sick in this whole situation is that both sides, evangelicals and deconstruction, keep telling me that their thought leaders have this all under control. They do not. And nobody ever shows me evidence that they do. Let's start with evangelicals. They focus everything on words. They think meaning is contained in words. So they focus on the dictionaries. And they think that the way to interpret is to run to a dictionary. And in the age of Google and AI, it's easy to do, right? And now they think they're interpreters, and they take issue with experts who actually know what they're talking about. And here's the problem. Dictionaries are great for learning a language. They're not great for interpretation. Why? Because they're post-interpretive. They presuppose that something has been interpreted already. Evangelicals easily turn that around and think dictionaries can help them interpret. Big mistake. What dictionaries really are doing for evangelicals, and why dictionaries feel so helpful to them, is they help them cover up that they don't know the original languages. Let's use an example. This channel is called Prohibition Theology, and the prohibition part should be fairly self-explanatory. But think about this for a minute. In the Prohibition era, they came up with all kinds of uses of words that were non-traditional. So they talk about the brick or the can or moonshine or sidecar or that kind of stuff. And because as a subculture, the mob did that consistently, eventually it took a hold and people knew what they meant by it. And you can run that experiment yourself. In fact, I did it as a student in Germany, not because I was thinking deeply about these things, but because a buddy and I were just being idiots, and we ran our own little social experiment inside a seminary, and this is what we did. We started using a few words opposite or very different from how they're normally used. And at first people were confused, and then they got a little bit angry because you're messing with us. So for instance, we started using the word motorcycle for the building in which the seminary was. So we might say things like, "Are you coming to the motorcycle tomorrow?" And people around us would think, what a strange thing to say. And eventually they get a little bit annoyed and they say, "You don't even have a motorcycle," which was true. We didn't. But the point is, you can use any word you want in any language you want, and you can make it refer to anything you want. You can even make it embody meaning that nobody else associates with that word. But you can do that only because they are devoid of meaning. They're empty symbols and they only acquire meaning. Actually, they never acquire meaning, but they contribute towards the construction of meaning by being assembled with other symbols into acts of communication, and that is where the meaning lies. A dictionary will not help you with that. A dictionary will only help you with learning the language. Therefore, if you do not know the original languages of the Bible, don't think that that dictionary is going to save you. Let me give you an example of how the wheels come off when we don't understand this stuff. So there's this word ecclesia, church, right? At least that's one way of translating it. And there you have the issue right there. I don't know how many times I've heard Christians say things like, ecclesia comes from the Greek, yes, true. And it consists of two parts. There's ek, which means out of, and there's klesia, which comes from kaleo, to be called. And they say what the word really means, and this is where the wheel's already wobbling, and then they fall off in a second. What the word really means is the called out ones. That is utter nonsense. Why? Because the word is never actually used in that manner until much, much later. So if you want to interpret the New Testament and the word ecclesia in it, you have to ask, how is the word actually used, not what is the inherent meaning of the word, because you get it so very, very wrong. If you take the English word understand, that is never used in the sense of standing under something. Could it be used that way? Of course. But out there in the wild, it's never used like that. And therefore, just like you wouldn't look at the word understand and say, oh, what it really means is to stand under something like under a roof, that's just stupid. You wouldn't do that. So why the heck do you do it with the word ecclesia? Just because you used an online Greek-English concordance or something and now you think you're an expert. Big mistake. If you operated like this in the medical world, your life would probably be at risk. That's the kind of damage we're talking about here. Fortunately, in this case, it's only your interpretation that's at risk, and the wheels have just fallen off. Could I give you hundreds more examples of this nature? Absolutely. And if you want some of them, text me. And if you do text me, I'm not going to give you another list. Just like people ask me for definitions, I'm not going to give you definitions. We're not going to find two-dimensional solutions to three-dimensional issues. So please don't ask me for definitions. And like I said, I'm not going to give you another list of examples of this, but I will tell you what I can do to help you become a decent interpreter. So when we started referring to the seminary building as a motorcycle, what that actually did, it got so much into the psyche, into the subconscious of people that when they were out there in the wild, there I did it with the wild, they're out there in the wild and they see a motorcycle, their brains associate that with a seminary. And they get annoyed about that because they're saying, it doesn't mean that. I know it doesn't mean that. Well, it does now. We just made it happen. And this is the thing. As humans, we can make stuff happen. In fact, by communicating, we cannot not make things happen. I don't know if you've ever thought about this. The moment we communicate, we are creating realities that can never be undone. We can deny them later. We can counteract them. We can, come up with counter realities. So if somebody misspeaks, for instance, they can never say afterwards, I didn't say that. They can only say, I misspoke. I mean, they could say they didn't say it, but it would be a lie. Why? Because that reality was created. It can never be undone. It is out there in time and space. In other words, whenever we communicate, we create realities. We are creators. And that's the reason why we can use empty symbols like words, use them any way we want. And if we do it persistently, they creep into the subconscious of other people and they can't even do a thing about it. The bottom line is that words do not have inherent meanings. And evangelicals can't get that into their heads, but the deconstruction community can, because their thought leaders have drilled it into them, and they're right. But then comes the big mistake on that side, because then the conclusion is being drawn carelessly that if words don't have inherent meanings, therefore texts don't have inherent meanings either. But they do. That's the big difference between a word and a text. Words in themselves do not create realities, but acts of communication do. So when I say text, I mean any act of communication. It could be verbal, it could be just a facial expression, it could be an actual written text, it could be this language, that language. Sometimes it could even be silence. Do you get my my point? Acts of communication absolutely embody meaning. And that meaning is inherent because acts of communication created realities that cannot be undone. You cannot say it never happened because you'd be lying. Do you see what I'm saying? Acts of communication are creating new realities. They happen. They happen in time and space, and they will forever have happened in time and space. You cannot say to time and space, undo that, unwind, go back, let's re-record this. You cannot do it. You can only add new acts of communication to it to try and mitigate the situation you created in the first place. Created is the operative word here. So once words that have no inherent meaning are shaped into acts of communication, the words are not the ones that carry the meaning. It's the act of communication that carries the meaning, and that's where we need to focus when we want to interpret. And a dictionary will not help you with that. A dictionary will make you feel good, and then you commit all the mistakes in the book, pardon the pun, because you don't understand hermeneutics. You've got to invest in this stuff. So here's my conclusion. Both evangelicals and people in deconstruction lose meaning. They lose everything ultimately, and they lose it for opposite reasons. Evangelicals think meaning lives in words, which it does not. And people in deconstruction think that they know that there is no meaning at all, even in text and acts of communication, because there's no meaning in words. So they both end up losing everything for reasons of mistakes that are actually opposite to each other. So people sometimes ask me, are you an evangelical or are you in deconstruction? You got to love that dichotomy, right? It's got to be one or the other. Of course, I'm not going to choose one or the other. I cannot be one or the other because they both make rudimentary mistakes. So purely on hermeneutical grounds, I would not be able to say I'm an evangelical. They have their own ways of mistreating the text, ask me how I know, or I'm in deconstruction that have different ways of mistreating the text, ask me how I know that. I currently live in a culture, this is the United States here, where everything seems to happen in binary ways. You're either conservative or you're liberal, up or down, Democrat or Republican, rich or poor. Everything is one or the other, and that's just not good enough. We need to be able to find our own ways that make hermeneutical sense, whereby we interpret well, we avoid these stupid mistakes that I just outlined, and we actually do a better job explaining the things that we communicate about. Our communication itself will be better, our reading of the Bible will be better, and if our reading of the Bible ends up being better, I'm not going to apologize for that either to evangelicals who don't like the readings that you actually end up with if you interpret the Bible well, nor am I going to apologize to the opposite side, the people in deconstruction who think, oh, you just want to defend the Bible. Well, what the heck's wrong with interpreting well, whether it's the Bible or anything else? And this is another thing. Sometimes people think that we should only interpret stuff well that we like, and that's the cart before the horse. You have to interpret everything well first. You have to start with that. How else could you decide whether it's good or not? But people lost their minds on this stuff. So they say, I don't need to interpret that well because I don't agree with it. What do you mean you don't agree with it? If you don't interpret it well first, how the heck would you know whether you're supposed to agree with it or not? So basically, I'm telling you, we're in a mess on the evangelical side, we're in a mess on the deconstruction side, and we've got to fix this stuff. By the way, if your church is split on this or that theological issue, the church is practically falling apart. What you need is not for someone to come in and help you with your theology. What you need is for someone to come in and help you with hermeneutics. Because that way everyone gets empowered. If you come in trying to argue the case for one particular theological viewpoint, you're going to lose the other half right away. With hermeneutics, you're empowering everyone. And theological differences of opinion are usually matters of hermeneutics to start with. Personally, I became aware of this stuff first when I was a student in England. When I finished my PhD, I was in Cambridge at the time. I decided that this is what I'm going to devote myself to, better interpretation for anything and everyone. It is the most quintessentially human skill you could possibly have. Why in the world would you not want to get better at it? If you're a so-called layperson, non-professional interpreter, or you just want to read the Bible better, or your newspaper, or whatever, or you go to court and you watch trials and you want to understand what's going on in the courtroom, or whatever the case may be, if you want to get better at this, please text me and let's be in touch. Same if you're a professional and you realize that you've never been taught this stuff properly. You may have had a class at seminary called hermeneutics and it never talked about this. That's kind of par for the course. Again, ask me how I know. Text me and we'll talk about how to move forward. No matter your age, no matter your background, no matter your job, you can become a good interpreter, and I'll help you get there. Even my PhD students have to invest in this. It's the number one thing I can teach them. But even if you're a normal Bible reader, your minds will be blown once you realize what the Bible is actually saying. And in future videos, I'll give you plenty of actual examples. So all I can say is text me. You can also go to my store and find a course called The Narrative Experience. It's going to start again in about 2 weeks. This is the second time we're running it. And if you want to talk to anyone who took it the first time, just let me know or text me. Our churches would be in much better shape if we paid attention to it. Actually, bring your church to the course.